Today we're talking about Guardians in solo lane. This will not be completely in-depth, but rather a quick overview of how to play Guardians in the solo lane in general, what you should pay attention to, what you should do when it comes to items, on a more basic level that will help you just generally understanding it. This is a topic that was requested in the comments and was upvoted a lot, so apparently there's a lot of demand for it, which is why I'm covering it. With that said, let's get into Guardians in solo. Now, Guardians in solo have been there since forever basically, but they haven't been wildly popular for the majority of the time. There were some exceptions. Sobek has been there for quite a while, Ymir has been there on and off, but in recent times we've seen a lot more Guardians in solo. The Guardians we're seeing at the moment are primarily Xingtian, Terra, a fair bit of Ymir, Cabrakan from time to time, and theoretically there's still Sobek, though he hasn't been played in solo lately in any of the matches I found, but he's still kinda up there. There are more Guardians that can be played in solo. In casual games you will often see Kumbhakana as well, and pretty much any Guardian has been played in solo at some point, but these are the more popular ones, and in terms of builds, even the other ones don't really go too far from where these Guardians are. So first of all, how do Guardians differ from warriors in solo lane? That depends very much on which warrior you're looking at. It's hard to compare warriors and Guardians when warriors in themselves are so different in how they are played in the solo lane. For example, Guan Yu would be played completely different from Hercules, whereas Hercules would be played different from Osiris, whereas Osiris would be played very differently from Amaterasu. So answering the question of how Guardians are different kinda doesn't really make sense, because Guardians are just other characters that have other individual playstyles in the solo lane. Generally, I would say the Guardians are much closer in how they are played between each other than the different warriors that we have. The more obvious difference is in the items they can buy, which basically boils down to them not being able to buy physical damage items or physical items in general, and they're still basically going for almost the same defense options though, because most of them are accessible for both. The most important difference is not so much in the later items, but rather in the starters. Whereas the warriors have access to various starters that make sense for them, mostly switching between a Bluestone, Pendant and Death Toll, depending on if you're looking for more early clear and regression or more sustain. The Guardians are mostly leaning more towards Mark of the Vanguard. The reasons for this go beyond the fact that it has physical defense. If it was only the physical defense, Mark of the Vanguard would still be nice, but it's rather in the other options that are there. The problem for Guardians is that they don't really scale too well with power. They don't have the highest scalings. That's reserved for mages. And as such, they don't really do well with starters that just primarily focus on power, whereas Mark of the Vanguard works really well for them because it gives them some defense against not only the enemy characters but also the minions, against tick damage, and they have high base values, and with these base values they will still deal decent amount of damage, whereas the damage from the other starters just doesn't do enough for them, as opposed to especially Bluestone, which doesn't depend on power for it to work and can help warriors clear much better. And that generally translates into the playstyle. As a Guardian in solo lane, you will most likely get out-cleared early, depending on what your opponent is, but if your opponent has any solid clear, and you're not the Guardian with the best clear of them all, you're not necessarily Cabrakan, who is really strong at the moment, for example, then you will expect to be out-cleared. And that's okay. As a Guardian, you're not looking to win boxing matches in solo lane most of the time. It can happen, but it's not your primary goal. Your primary goal is to roll out of solo lane in late game or mid game maybe, be very farmed, not fed, farmed, and have as much impact on team fights as possible. You can be very tanky, you can often have a lot of sustain as a Guardian, and that way you will have an impact, often it's through your ultimate especially as well. Think Xingtian, think Sobek, think Terra especially. And their purpose is not to be the best boxer out there, and that is the mindset you have to get rid of. And I think this is a main part of why many people struggle with the transition to Guardians in solo. Because usually solo lane is a lot about slapping down the enemy, bullying them out, and trying to get these small victories in between by taking camps and so on. Many specifics are down to your team. Some of the Guardians are very dependent on their blue buff, so you want to try and get your jungler to frequently help you out with that, because early on you can't really clear it on your own. Whereas other solos don't really need that. Sobek doesn't need blue buffs later into the game because he can pretty much sustain himself via his ultimate. So once again, it depends on the team, it depends on you, it depends on your character. but overall you are most likely not expected to do as much on your own. You are expected to stay in lane, not die, because you have Vanguard and you are a very tanky character. You're not supposed to somehow, well, overstep your boundaries, be very aggressive and die for it. And yeah, you're gonna be mostly an annoyance to the enemy. In a way, I guess it's somewhat close to how Loki is played in solo, because he also is primarily an annoyance and doesn't really look for trades in most situations. There are exceptions, obviously. But with the Guardian, the difference is that your purpose later on is not split pushing, but actually helping in team fights as much as possible. As such, when there is a window to do something, when the lane is cleared and your buffs are also cleared, then what you should be looking for is not tower push most of the time, because you're really not pushing towers very much. Instead, if there is an option, just push the wave into tower and then rotate out and try to have an impact with your extremely strong ultimate. You still have the normal duties of any solo laner, so for example, you're usually expected to have teleport in order to prevent split pushes and stuff like that. Nothing really changes there. What changes a little bit are obviously the builds, and that's what we're going to talk about here. As mentioned, you almost always want to start Mark of the Vanguard. Clearly niche cases always exist, and I know that somebody can prove me wrong and show that he can do better with another item, but in 99% of the cases, Mark of the Vanguard is the way to go. Likewise, you almost always want Shoes of the Magi. It is very good for a Guardian to have penetration. It amplifies their damage much more than Power would, because they have high base values and you want to look for as much penetration as possible. And it helps with clearing a fair bit. There is the option to go into Shoes of Focus, but it's very rarely done and you have to know exactly why you're doing it. Maybe you feel like you need that extra sustain over some extra damage or something like that, but usually it's not the case and you can still trade out later if you feel like you really need the extra CDR. After that, it very much depends on the matchup, and that's the same as with any solo laner. So instead of telling you which item you should build in which order, I'll just generally tell you some items that are good for solo laners, and you can make up your own mind about when to build which. This is important to me because I think if you want to play solo lane actively, then you already need to have an understanding of items. You can't just go into solo lane with a, well, copy-paste build and think that you're going to be successful depending on the matchup. This is why I rarely actually put out any kind of solo guides for in terms of items, because it doesn't really make sense. You have to know which item you build in which situation. But I'm going to mention the items that I think are generally good, that are picked up a lot in the pro scene, and that just makes sense for Guardians. One you will very often see is Breastplate of Valor. Breastplate of Valor is great to counter physical guards. It is good because it has defense, and any defense item really is good for a Guardian in solo. And it also has cooldown reduction, which is a very important stat. It also has mana, which helps you with staying in lane longer. Likewise, it has MP5 for the very same purpose. So overall, a very strong item. The next one is Voidstone. Voidstone often more bought against other magical solo laners because it gives you magical power, magical protection, and some penetration. And once again, penetration, or protection reduction rather in this case, is a very strong stat. Especially helpful here because it's also for your teammates, so it's really somewhat support-ish. Whereas your support will usually not be able to buy it, and solo you very much have room to build it. Another good item is always going to be Spirit Robe. Rarely build that early. It can be built early, but it's usually built a little bit later. Just an overall strong item. Once again, defense of both kinds, plus CDR, and a good defensive extra passive, so very helpful. Pestilence, always very good against magical damage dealers and against healers, so especially with the health on it, it is one of the better items. And I always think this is important to point out, that because you build defense and health together, you get a lot of effective health, which helps like all your items that you're going to build throughout the game. Another item that you can frequently make use of is Winged Blade. Usually nothing you want to build all too early. You want to have some defense against your lane opponent before that, and then you can look to get some health via Winged Blade and also counter slows. There are also more situational items, especially Rod of Asclepius, very often being built later into the game on Terra because of the extra healing, not necessarily helpful for every Guardian in the solo lane. Another item that you can see sometimes is Gauntlet of Thebes. This is when your support didn't have room to build that item, and also because it splits the auras between two players, which means that if one of your tanks frontliners dies, you still have half of the auras. Looking at pro builds, there are some less popular items that are getting picked up from time to time as well. For example, Mid Guardian Male, even Sands of Time as a secondary starter, Shogun's Kusari, Stone of Gaia, but most of these haven't really shown great success as opposed to the other ones. Another item that is always worth mentioning is Hide of the Nemean Lion, just against very strong physical comps. While not that popular in the pro scene, I personally really enjoy putting Stone of Binding into the build at a later point as well. It's just some cheap extra defense stats and a nice extra effect for your teammates when you CC an enemy. I personally enjoy that very much. I would not argue for or against its viability. There are obviously a lot more choices, but I think these are the more popular and more frequently used ones that really make sense for you to keep in mind when going into a game and considering what you want to build against your lane opponent. There are some items that I would like to point out that I don't think are that viable, especially not in earlier stages of the game. I know that many people are tempted to go for more power-focused builds and build something like Warlock Sash in order to stack a lot of health and power in the long run. And while I see the idea behind it, it is honestly, in my opinion, far from ideal for Guardians in solo lane. It just doesn't really synergize with the fact that they don't scale too well off power, and that you're gonna have a much weaker early game. You're not gonna get the CDR you want, you're not gonna get the pen, you're not gonna get the auras for your teams, you're not gonna get the actual defense, you're just gonna get health, which can be countered a lot easier. So all of this comes together. Kind of goes for Ethereal as well, though that can maybe be considered late game. Likewise, Gem of Isolation can be considered later, but not the ones that I would frequently pick up in solo lane, where you have to basically match your lane opponent, and you're more of a secondary frontliner than a damage-oriented mage kind of Guardian, really. If that would be what you're looking to play, then you would probably be better off in the jungle with that particular kind of item set, so somebody like Jungle Cabrakan can do that very well. Whereas in solo lane, it's kind of expected for you to be more frontline oriented. As for chalices, I do believe that especially the mana chalice can help the self-healing Guardians, but it is not necessary. Likewise, you can consider the health chalice, but it's also something that you have to, well, figure out for yourself how you like your items, your consumables best. To answer the question of the Guardian most suitable for you, I would say either just go with the one you're already familiar playing from another role, or if you're not sure yet and you just want to see what you can put into solo, I would recommend starting with Xingtian or Sobek. Even if Sobek is not that popular at the moment, these two have a very easy time sustaining in solo. They usually don't struggle too much without the mana buff. They can still have an impact and they can still handle things on their own. And as such, I think they are very much good beginner solo Guardians. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this answered the question a little bit of how to play Guardians in the solo lane. I hope this was insightful. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to click that sub button and maybe the bell next to it down below. I will see you for the next one tomorrow. ZiSotto, out.